This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 12 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, March 25th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. The Academy closed this week Friday for the usual spring vacation of 1 week, while the William E. Frost School has 2 weeks recess this week and next. Mrs. Alonzo Sutherland is enjoying a week's vacation from household cares, dividing the time with her 3 sisters, Mrs. Marden of Woburn, Mrs. Clark of Somerville, and Mrs. Cameron, also of Somerville. Mrs. Wayland F. Balch, who has had a serious ill turn, is reported as more comfortable. Mrs. Rachel Reed, who has been spending the winter months with her daughter, Mrs. Herbert V. Hildreth, has returned to her home in Graniteville. A dozen of the young people of the village, mostly from the Academy, went to Chelmsford last Friday evening to the 17th of March dancing party and report a very pleasant time. James D. Wilson took the party in his barge, and Miss Edith Lawrence chaperoned the party. There seems to be a reluctance for them to refer to the 17th of March as St. Patrick's Day. Reverend Mr. Wallace, David Wallace, gave an excellent address Sunday evening to his hearers on, quote, the Church and Board of Trade, end quote. He presented most sensibly what the Church's attitude should be to the welfare of the town. Mrs. Julian A. Cameron sailed on Saturday with her sister, Mrs. Julian Kebler of Brookline, from New York for a European trip. Mrs. Cameron expects to be away about 2 months. The maiden name of these 2 sisters was Abbott, and they were the daughters of John William Abbott and Elizabeth Southwick. John William was one of the 3 co-founders of Abbott Worsted Company, along with his father and Charles G. Sargent. The ladies of the Unitarian Society are planning for a pleasant whist party and social in their vestry the evening of the 31st. The next section is the Grange section. At the last meeting of the Grange, the business hour was occupied with voting on the names of the 21 applicants for membership. These candidates will receive the first and second degrees at the next meeting, April 6th. The entertainment of the evening consisted of a peddler's parade in charge of Mrs. Edson G. Boynton and Mrs. Leonard Wheeler. It was to be regretted that the weather for the evening was such that it could not but affect the attendance, but nearly every one of those who took part, about 25 in all, were present and carried out the parts assigned to them most creditably, some of the costumes being particularly good. The audience, though small, was appreciative, and later the wares of the ice cream, cake, candy, popcorn, peanut, and fruit vendors made very acceptable refreshments. The ladies' degree staff, under the direction of drill master Henry M. Wright, are rehearsing for their work for the second meeting of April. Next is the section on the Tadmuck Club, the ladies' club in the center. The regular meeting of the Tadmuck Club took place Tuesday afternoon in Liberty Hall, which is in South Chelmsford, with a good attendance. The program for the afternoon was the Panama Canal, in charge of Mrs. Benjamin H. Bailey. Mrs. Bailey had prepared a most interesting theme full of research and giving a clear idea of the magnitude of this great enterprise. She outlined the Panama of 50 years ago and of today, sketching the de Lesseps enterprise and many other features of interest. Mrs. Edith Foster supplemented Mrs. Bailey's paper with interesting and entertaining extracts from letters from a friend in Panama. Lepsis, who's mentioned here, is Ferdinand Marie Vicomte de Lesseps, who died in 1894, he was the French developer of the Suez Canal in 1869, which substantially reduced sailing distances and times between the West and the East. His enterprise, as referred to here, was an attempt to repeat this success by building a sea-level Panama Canal during the 1880s, but the project was devastated by epidemics of malaria and yellow fever in the area, and the projected de Lesseps Canal was left uncompleted and eventually superseded by a non-sea level canal with locks built by the United States and completed in 1914. That's the Panama Canal that we know today. At the next meeting, the subject for the afternoon will be the last in the season special topic for study of Spanish North America, and will be Florida, past and present, in charge of Mrs. David Wallace. There will be a paper by Miss M. Eudora Jones of Lunenburg on, quote, Florida of the past, end quote, and one by Miss Lillian B. Atwood on, quote, personal recollections of Florida. Lillian Atwood and her two sisters, who lived at 4 Graniteville Road, wintered in Florida every year, so she was quite familiar with Florida. The next section is the About Town section. Joseph Moran, who has been seriously ill with pneumonia, died at his home near Westford Station on Monday forenoon. He was 65 years old and a veteran of the Civil War, and has been a resident of the town for the past 20 years. He was an expert tool sharpener by trade and worked at the various stone quarries in town. He is survived by a wife, 2 daughters, Mrs. Isles and Miss Mary Moran of Westford, and 1 son, Frank Moran of California, 2 sisters and 1 brother. Charles Raymond, who had been conducting a small grocery store and pool room at Marshall's Hall at Westford Corner, has closed out his business and moved to Maryland. His father, who has been employed on the Fletcher Quarry, has also moved back to Maryland with his family. Arthur G. Boynton, who has been in the retail milk business for about 25 years, during this period, securing his milk in Westford, has sold his route to Mr. Carson of North Tewksbury. Arthur Boynton was the brother of Edson Boynton, mentioned previously. Mr. Brown of Lowell, who has more recently engaged in the milk business, has sold his likes and dislikes to Herman Decatur, well known in Westford as a native of the Brookside precinct. Those changes make a shakeup in the long, reliable plans and methods of some farmers. The annual town meeting brought out the fact that only 15 towns in Middlesex County have a lower tax rate than Westford. Don't be afraid to buy a farm, house, or home in Westford on account of high taxes. Some of us are bound to keep taxes down if we have to be a minority of 1 to vote yes on an amendment to, quote, appropriate, end quote, money instead of, quote, raising, end quote, money. With water, lights, electric cars, schools, playgrounds, library, fire department, churches, and sunset scenery sky high and the town dry, what is lacking? Mrs. Toye, spelled T-O-Y-E, and Mrs. Newbald of West Chelmsford, members of the Grandmothers Club, made a friendly grandmother visit with their companion grandmother, Mrs. Samuel L. Taylor, last week at her home, the Old Oaken Bucket, which is at the corner of Lowell and Stony Brook Roads. And, of course, this was written by Samuel L. Taylor, Mrs. Samuel L. Taylor's husband. Next, we have the town meeting section. At the annual town meeting last Monday, the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher was elected moderator, William H. Burbeck and Arthur Wilson were appointed ballot clerks, Walter Wooden, Joseph Wall, Walter Merritt, William Burbeck, and Arthur Wilson counting tellers. The polls opened at 8 a.m. and by special vote closed at 1:45 p.m. Those were the polls for electing town officers. 304 ballots were cast and 2 registered women voted for school committee. After 5 hours and 15 minutes voting, it was decided that the following persons would be considered prudent men to manage town affairs: Selectman Oscar Spaulding, Assessor J. Willard Fletcher, Tax Collector Leonard Wheeler, Auditor William Taylor, Overseer of the Poor Albert Choate, School Committee John Spinner and Fred E. Reed, Cemetery Commissioner George Day, Trustee of Library Benjamin Bailey, Constables Edson Boynton and John Sullivan, Treasurer Harwood Wright, nicknamed Dick Wright, Tree Warden, the only contested office on the ballot, resulted in a vote of 175 for Harry Nesmith, the present incumbent, to 116 for Daniel J. McLeod. The vote on licensing the sale of intoxicating liquors resulted in drought for another year. Yes, 113, no, 175. The town voted itself able to raise and collect the following sums of money, and not a taxpayer doubted his ability to go down in his pocket and find his proportionate share. Public library, $800, cemeteries, $150, roads, $3,600, town debts, $6,500, support of poor, $1,200, public schools, $9,500, high school, $2,600. I believe at this time Westford Academy was still operated by the trustees of the Academy, and a special arrangement was made for Westford residents to attend the Academy, and I think this $2,600 went to pay for that. Textbooks, $500. Salary of superintendent, $800. Repairs in schoolhouses, $700. Sprayer for moth department, $550. Moth department, $800. Fire department, $400. Fire extinguishers, $140. Medical inspector of schools, $75. Memorial Day, $150. Transportation of library books, $75. Notes and interest, $5,500. State and county tax, $5,600. Hydrants, $1,760, making a total of $32,040. Ah, the good old days. Prices are a little higher these days. Article 3 of the town meeting was to see if the town will vote to accept Chapter 423 of the Acts of 1909 entitled, quote, "An Act relative to the sale of ice cream, confectionery, soda water, and fruit on the Lord's Day," end quote. This article was laid on the table pending a call for the reading of the statutes relative to such sale. The statutes not being available in the twinkling of an eye, the town got nervous and proceeded with the rest of the warrant. Later, when the statutes had been read and explained, and there appearing to be nothing seriously inhuman or menacing, voted to accept Chapter 423, allowing the selectmen to grant such licensing on the Lord's Day. Article 14, relative to the purchase of a power sprayer for the purpose of destroying the moth pests, Captain Fletcher read a letter from the state forester, offering on behalf of the state to pay one-half of the cost of this sprayer. Upon this statement, the town, in hurry-up time, voted itself in co-partnership with the state to purchase a sprayer and contribute $550 towards calling it a trade. Article 24, relating to lighting the streets at Westford, Graniteville, Forge Village, and Brookside. The town, listening to the report of John C. Abbott, chairman of the committee to investigate the cost of lighting on the part of the Board of Trade, unanimously voted to constitute the selectmen and aforesaid committee, a committee to enter into contract with the Lowell Electric Light Company for lighting the streets for a period of 5 years. Article 25, calling for an additional hydrant at Forge Village after explanation by Julian A. Cameron that the new hydrant was needed near the new houses in process of erection on Union Street, now East Prescott Street. The town generously voted to support another hydrant. The town voted for more fire extinguishers outside of the water district. The names of persons in whose custody they are left to be published in the annual town report, and said persons to be held responsible for the care of the same. Article 33. The town handed over a deed of thanks to Donald M. Cameron, Oscar Spaulding, and William Woods for the gift of land to enlarge the Whitney Playground. If this is not sufficient compensation, may they draw heavily on the dividends of healthful pleasure that their land is dedicated to. Article 36, relating to the suppression of the liquor traffic. On motion of Edward Abbott, this article was laid on the table, pending the vote of the town on the license question. When it was ascertained that the town had voted a drought, the selectmen were given an open door to money and men to enforce the dry verdict. The next section is the Forge Village section. Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton of Central Street are rejoicing over the arrival of a baby boy at their home Friday morning. This was Frederick A. Morton, who was born March 17, 1911. Reverend Michael E. Doherty officiated at the services in Abbott's Hall on Sunday morning and preached a very efficient sermon on the gospel of the day. The mills of the Abbott Worsted Company closed on Monday to give the voters an opportunity to attend the annual town meeting. Services, which were very well attended, were held in St. Andrew's Mission on Sunday morning for the Russian churchgoers of the village and vicinity. The services were conducted by Reverend Jacob Grego of Boston, and I believe were given in Russian. In the afternoon, at the usual hour, Reverend Mr. Burkhead of Groton School conducted services and spoke very effectively. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held their regular meeting on Wednesday afternoon. The usual Lenten services were held at the Mission Wednesday evening at 7:30 o'clock. The Girls' Friendly Society held their meeting after the services. Self-Help Lodge, IOOF, that's the Odd Fellows, held its regular meeting in Abbott Hall on Monday evening. Many of this village attended the social dance held in Ayer on St. Patrick's Night. Born on March 17th to Mr. and Mrs. M. Manton, well, it's spelled M-A-N-T-O-N here, but the father was really Mike Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, of Pleasant Street, a baby girl. They named her Stephanie. Cameron School closed on Friday afternoon for the annual spring vacation. Miss Sarah Precious was the guest over Sunday of her sister, Mrs. Michael Keefe, of Townsend Harbor. Her maiden given name was Annie Precious. Miss Catherine Moffat, formerly of this village, visited her many friends here at the weekend. Miss May Lord, one of the village's popular young ladies, has resigned her position with the Abbott Worsted Company to take up a course in nursing. Miss Lord enters upon her new duties April 1st. A large number from this village attended the Lenten services held in Healy's Hall, Graniteville, on last Tuesday evening. The Mrs. Socha left Tuesday for New York. Next, we have the About Town section. The last Farmers Institute of the season will be held at the Town Hall, Chelmsford Center, Wednesday, March 29th. F.S. Larned will give a 30-minute talk on, quote, practical uses of cement for farmers, end quote. This will be followed by an address by Professor H.F. Hall of the New Hampshire Agricultural College on, quote, specialties in farming, end quote. Dinner at the noon hour. In the afternoon, Professor Hall will give an address on the business side of apple growing. Dodds and Struthers of Fitchburg will follow with a talk on lightning rod demonstration. Not sure how they demonstrated it, but it'd be interesting to know, I guess. The funeral of Joseph Moran was held from his home on Wednesday afternoon. Reverend David Wallace conducted the services. The bearers were J. Willard Fletcher, Fenimore Morton, Joseph Sears, and J.W. Parker. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery. Henry O. Kais has served notice on the selectmen of an intended lawsuit with the town on account of a defective highway. The sale of the Henry B. Reed Farm to George A. Drew is reported. Mr. Drew will be remembered as a native of Westford and a graduate of Old Historic Westford Academy, and at present manager of a large estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Mr. Reed will very likely be retained as manager. That's the news in Westford for the week ending March 25th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.